And an old record that you would make from a booth that you would make your own record booth.
What's on it? What's on it?
It's my friends and I. We must have crammed about 6 people into this record booth,
Okay.
and it's our own version of the movie The Wolfman.
The Wolfman.
And a couple more buttons. This button says Vice President, Famous Monsters Club. And then I have a little pin here. It says, I have seen the future. General Motors Futurama, New York World's Fair, 1964. So anyway, again, my wife calls me a pack rat, and she's right. I'll explain why these are important to the writing process later.
That's your boyhood. That's what you went through.
Well, it's not necessary to introduce Roger. He's already a flame and has already started, which is really wonderful. And thank you for all coming. Professor Solberg came to Edinburgh University in 1989. He's taught at the University of Iowa, the University of Texas, and San Antonio. His PhD at the University of Indiana in Pennsylvania. His essays have been published in the New York Times, Traditional Home Family Money, Lake Erie Lifestyle, the Harrisburg Patriot News, and most importantly for our purposes this morning, his hometown newspaper, the Staten Island Advance. A number of his publications are about baseball, including a chapter of a book on Babe Ruth at 100, a collection of scholarly pieces about the legendary Bambino. He's created a number of multiple new courses at Edinburgh, including advanced creative nonfiction. I thought that might be used as a political science class. and the literature of baseball. Please welcome Professor Roger Solberg.
Thanks, Bob. You can see the title of my talk is New York City's Forgotten Borough, Staten Island Boyhood, and the Art of Memoir Writing. And again, I'm basing this on a book that I'm currently working on. I was on sabbatical last spring to work on these essays, and it's a long way from being finished, but I have a number of pieces that are relatively in good shape. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of background about Staten Island, since nobody knows anything about Staten Island. People know everything about New York City, but not about Staten Island. And then I will talk a little bit about the process of writing a book like this, and some of the things that I tell my students, and we talk about in our classes, about how you write, again, personal nonfiction, essays and memoirs, and what that involves. And then I have some excerpts here from some of the pieces that I'm working on. And I consider all of these still works in progress, but it will give you somewhat of an idea of sort of my angle on the book, the voice of the book, that sort of thing. So we'll get to this next slide in a second. When I tell people I grew up in New York City, they probably picture scenes like this. If we could have the next slide. Endless concrete and tall buildings, the occasional tree struggling for breath. There's constant noise, car horns, ambulances, road crews, construction equipment, and the low rumble of the subway beneath your feet. When you think of New York City, that's what you think of. Okay, next slide, please. But this is the New York City of my youth. Miles of unspoiled wilderness, lakes, ponds, and streams, People rode horses past my house. On warm summer nights, the bullfrogs across the street would keep me awake. Raccoons raided our garbage can, and pheasants squawked in the distance. Midtown Manhattan, only about 20 miles from my front door, might as well have been 1,000 miles distant. Okay, next slide. 1609, the explorer Henry Hudson gave Staten Island its name, Staten Island. He was sailing for the Dutch, and he named it after the Dutch Parliament, Staten Generaal. So Staten Island literally means simply States Island. Not all that interesting. And you can see this map here from 1706. Long Island is here and Staten Island is here. A lot of people confuse Long Island and Staten Island. They don't realize they're two different things. Long Island is long. Staten Island, not so much. Next slide, please. This is a gravestone. I will read it to you. It's kind of hard to see in the back. And this is a gravestone in a little cemetery in a town called Rossville on Staten Island. It says, memory of Elizabeth Pullion, daughter of James and Catherine Seguin, who died June 6, 1820, aged 58 years. This little cemetery has grave markers going back to the 1700s. The Pullion family settled on Staten Island in the late 1600s, in the 1690s. They were French Huguenots fleeing religious persecution. Elizabeth was born into the Seguin family, another French Huguenot family, and there is still a Seguin Avenue on Staten Island. There's still a Lake Seguin on Staten Island. So a lot of these old families are still very much present. Some of the first settlers are very prominent in terms of names of towns, names of geographical features, and so on. So the French, some of the French settled here, but it was mostly the Dutch at first. And a lot of the town names, there's a town called New Dorp on Staten Island, which simply means new town. There's a body of water called Kil Van Kull. Again, that's another Dutch name. So the Dutch influence is a street called Van Duzer Street. The Dutch influence is very prominent on Staten Island. But by the end of the 1600s, the British took over. And during the Revolutionary War, the residents of Staten Island were staunch supporters of King George. Next slide, please. I grew up in a house on 257 Pullion Avenue, so my street was named after those early French settlers. And I show you these pictures again to emphasize the difference between Staten Island and the rest of New York. And this is my house. And we were across the street from, we called it the swamp, across the street from this wonderful lake. And on this lake we paddled canoes, we paddled a homemade raft, we went fishing, we hunted for frogs and turtles. There was muskrats in this lake. There were kingfishers and herons in this lake. I'm sure that when you think New York City, this is not what comes to mind. But this is exactly the environment in which I grew up, and thank goodness it is still that way today. That whole area of the island where I used to live is now a New York State wildlife preserve. So we've got several square miles of nothing but unspoiled wilderness still within the confines of New York City. Next slide, please. Just a little geography review here. Some people don't have a clear sense of New York geography. You know, there are 5 boroughs of New York. There's Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. Next slide, please. Now, when you think of the other boroughs, some sort of image comes to mind. Manhattan has all the skyscrapers. Brooklyn's got Coney Island. Queens has the old New York World's Fair. Queens is also the home of the New York Mets. And of course, the Bronx has Yankee Stadium. So every one of these boroughs is associated with a very well-known landmark. Name me a landmark that Staten Island is associated with.
The ferry.
Next slide, please. The Staten Island Ferry.
Narrows Bridge.
And the bridge.
That's you.
The ferry, the trouble with the ferry is that it's not on Staten Island. It just goes to Staten Island. So I can't quite call it a landmark. And of course, there's like more than a dozen ferries. There's no sort of one thing. And of course, it goes right by the Statue of Liberty. Now, some people think the Statue of Liberty is on Staten Island, but it's not. The Statue of Liberty is on Liberty Island. And then there's Ellis Island, which is another island altogether. So this is the only thing that most people associate Staten Island with. And most people, when they take the ferry, they simply get off in the ferry terminal and then get back on the next ferry and go back to Manhattan. They don't really do anything in terms of seeing what's on Staten Island, partially because public transportation is a hassle. It's not like the other boroughs. There are no subways. You have to take a bus, or you have to get on the Staten Island train, which only stops in a certain number of towns. It can't really get you everywhere. So it's difficult to get around. So consequently, people don't bother with
When
Staten
did
Island.
Staten Island become, legally part of New York City or whatever?
When did it? 1898. That's when New York City was incorporated.
Okay.
Up until then, there were separate cities. Like Brooklyn was a separate city up until 1898. Next slide, please. Now, a little closer. Now, you can't read these, but this is Staten Island is sort of broken down, at least among people who live there, in sort of different parts. Now, where I live is what they call the South Shore. This is the southernmost point of all of New York State, is right here. And the North Shore is up here, and the ferry terminal is here, and that's where you get the ferry to Manhattan. So this body of water here is a New York harbor. And right here, you don't see it, but it's the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which is the bridge that can take you over to Brooklyn. So I grew up in this area here. I grew up in a town called Annandale, which was named after a woman named Anna Seguin. Again, the Seguin family, very early settlers. It's a town called Huguenot because a lot of the French Huguenots settled on Staten Island. Princess Bay and Tottenville, where I went to high school. Now, Staten Island is not that big. If we superimpose this map over a map of Erie County, let's say that St. George, where the ferry terminal is, let's say that's the Mill Creek Mall. Then Tottenville, southern Tottenville, is like Hobbs Lumber. It's only 14 miles long. It's not big at all, and it's maybe 7 miles wide at its widest point. So it's a small place, but what's interesting is that despite the fact that it's so small, at least when I was a kid, it was very provincial. So if you grew up on the South Shore, as I did, you pretty much stayed there. I didn't know anything, and I still don't know anything about this end of Staten Island. I have gotten lost on this end of Staten Island. Just within the last couple of years, I've gotten lost there. So the people who live there have a strong sense of their community. The individual towns have still very much of a small town feel. Every one of them has their own little business district that's maybe a block long, with a pharmacy and a delicatessen and maybe a restaurant and a gas station, and they're all sort of their own little thing. Now, when I was a kid, they also had sort of an ethnic identity. Like Annandale, where I grew up, was a lot of Scandinavians. This town called Newdorp was a lot of Italians. Over on this side of the island, there were a lot of Czechs. And right in here, around Rossville, there was an area called Sandy Ground, which was one of the very, very earliest African American settlements in the United States. Either freed slaves or people who just settled there. So it really has an interesting sort of sociology and geography. So that's a little bit about, a little background about Staten Island. Now, again, in the spring of 2018, I was on a sabbatical to write a memoir about growing up in this really quite extraordinary environment. The fact that you're so close to the biggest city in the world, and you would not even know it if nobody told you. It's actually a collection of essays. I don't see it as a continuous narrative. It's a series of snapshots about things I've done, or people I knew, or these sorts of things, or about some of the objects on the table here. And so I wanted to do this book because I wanted to make Staten Island a little less obscure. And I also think that living in this kind of environment, I have some interesting stories to tell, and I'll get to some of those in a few minutes. I will read some excerpts here. But first I want to talk about the composing process. How one goes about writing a memoir or a personal essay. Now, I'm constantly revising the pieces that I've written. And there are several in the book I have not even started. When I start a new essay, I have no goal or theme in mind. I usually begin with a concrete image, an object, an object. What do these copper sulfate crystals mean to me? Well, they mean a great deal to me. I'm not quite sure what, but the only way I'm going to know is if I write about it. If I don't write about it, then part of their mystery will remain a mystery. So, again, I don't start with an idea. I'm going to write about friendship or something like that. You start with a physical object in the world, or you start with a scene, and you see where it takes you. It's best not to plan too much. Start anywhere. This is what I tell my students. Start anywhere and see what happens. As you move further through the process, and you start to get an idea of what your story or your essay is about, then you can start thinking about organizing it and focusing it and transitions and all that stuff. But only after you discover what it means. And for me anyway, the only way you do that is to start. You can't sit there with pen in hand or staring at a screen and wait for the muse to descend upon you. The only way the muse is going to descend upon you is if you do the work. And then you might get some breaks in terms of this sort of aha moment. But you must be an active participant in that process. I truly believe that too much order too soon is no good, which is why I don't like outlines. Now, I hope that my essays give my readers something with which they can identify. There are many aspects of growing up that we all have in common. Curiosity and adventure, pushing the boundaries of your world, creativity and imagination, friendship, coping with fear and the unexpected. I'm also writing, again, because I need to understand my experiences better, to discover things about them that I never realized. If there's one thing I tell my students, it's that writers write to find out, not merely to record what they already know. And let me give you an example of that. Let's see here. Next slide. This is something called needle ice. And little tiny ice crystals that form in like muddy ground. And I knew that I wanted to write about this. I had no idea what I wanted to say. I just knew that this had to be a part of my book because it's such a vivid image from my childhood. And so I just want to read you one paragraph from my essay. The title of the essay is Frozen Mud. Sometimes in January or February there was a brief thaw. The ground alongside our house became soft and muddy. Outcrops of moss got squishy Then an overnight cold snap. The April-like mud was caught off guard and froze in an instant. The next morning I would go out to the patches of earth that only yesterday looked like dull, ordinary, run-of-the-mill wet soil. Now they had been transfigured. The quick frozen mud was laced with delicate columnar ice crystals, perhaps an inch tall. The flat brown expanse had become a phalanx of glittering pinnacles, like splinters of diamond, with a tiny dirt cap crowning each one, or a green cap if the crystals had sprung from beneath the moss. I'd lie on my belly and look at them, pretending I had discovered a jewel-encrusted cavern, like the one in the movie Journey to the Center of the Earth. Next slide, please. Which I had seen on the big screen a few years earlier. I would have given anything to be with James Mason and Pat Boone when they crawled into a geode the size of my house. So,
That's great.
anyway, again, you start with an image. You start with an image. You don't start with an idea. You don't start with a goal. What do I want to know? And that's another thing I ask my students. What does this writer want to know about this topic? Does this writer need something? And the only way to get it is to write about it. To me, that's the only way you get things done. My book is not a straight line narrative. It's a series of short personal essays in roughly chronological order. The first memory I describe goes back to when I was 5 years old. The book ends when I'm 21 and about to begin my senior year of college. Next slide, please. Roughly speaking, a memoir is 50% what we remember and 50% how we remember. The writer and editor William Zinsser, in his book Inventing the Truth, The Art and Craft of Memoir, it's a perfect title, Inventing the Truth, has this to say about memoirs. Memoir is how we make sense of who we are, who we once were, and what values and heritage shaped us. If a writer seriously embarks on that quest, readers will be nourished by the journey, bringing along many associations of quests of their own. Memoir writers must manufacture a text, imposing narrative order on a jumble of half-remembered events. With that feat of manipulation, they arrive at a truth that is theirs alone, not quite like anybody else who was present at the same events. End quote. Zinsser opens up several cans of worms here. First, there's the idea that we impose the narrative framework. It's not handed to us. It's not inherent in the universe. It's something we create. As Joan Didion, one of my favorite writers, once said, quote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live," end quote. We must make sense of the hodgepodge of events that is our lives. Zinsser says that writers arrive at a truth that is theirs. Someone else who witnessed the same events, who grew up under the same roof, has created a very different world for himself or herself. Thus, a memoir is about your truth. Although successful memoirs and essays do reveal universal truths about who we are as human beings. Now, Joan Didion, in her essay on keeping a notebook, recalls an event that other members of her family dispute. Quote, "Perhaps it never did snow in August in Vermont. Perhaps there never were flurries in the night wind. And maybe no one else felt the ground hardening and the summer already dead, even as we pretended to bask in it. But that was how it felt to me. And it might as well have snowed. could have snowed, did snow. See why I love Joan Didion?
Yeah.
Holy cow. This doesn't mean that memoirs are about fabricating memories. Several writers in recent years have gotten into a lot of trouble over that. Somebody was given a dressing down by Oprah on national TV. What it does mean is that we tell the story as we know it, that we discover a truth that speaks to us. It takes a lot of work to do that. Writing a memoir or an essay requires a great deal more than simply summarizing a sequence of events. An essay, a memoir, must be an act of discovery. Memoirists are asked how they can remember such vivid details, even conversations, decades later. I don't know. Some things just stick with you. When I use dialogue in my book, which I do infrequently, I do so only if I'm sure about what was said. Can I guarantee that they are the exact words? No. But a close enough version of them has stayed with me. I would never make stuff up. What's the point if you can't be true to your material? And I say this to all writers, then don't write about it. Now, the remainder of my presentation will consist of short excerpts from a number of my essays. I tried to select pieces that will give you a sense of what it was like to live on Staten Island during the 1960s and early 70s. I also wanted to give you a feel for the voice and point of view that I'm trying to create. What's a good time to take a break? Is this too early?
Up to you, Roger. You've just gotten started, so.
I'll read a few of these,
Yeah.
and then we can have a little break. Next slide, please. The excerpt we're going to read first is from an essay called The Colorado River. Again, there were lots of streams and creeks and everything in Staten Island. And there was one in particular that my friends and I named the Colorado River. The inspiration for the name came from the unassuming brook's location at the bottom of a precipitous ravine. After a heavy rainstorm, our tranquil little creek was transformed into a fast-moving, churning torrent, the color of chocolate milk. The rapids, now knee-deep, were so swift and the engorged stream so wide that anyone attempting to cross it would be swept away by the current. With the walls of the gully as high and steep as they were, all the rainwater was funneled into the stream bed and had nowhere to go except straight into our dreams of high adventure. Now, these pictures actually were taken when I was in high school. The sort of the point of view of the narrator here is like a 9 or 10-year-old kid. In summers when I was young, the foliage down there seemed tropically dense and lush. The atmosphere always felt humid, even during the driest drought. Huge trees created an almost Amazonian canopy. Frogs and salamanders lived among and underneath the wet stones. Dragonflies' wings crackled in the air. Motes of pollen swirled in the shafts of sunlight. Emerald moss, soft as velour, and coated with water droplets, spread over the rotting logs and tree stumps. Everything smelled rich with decay and new life. Around 1962 or 63, whenever we first discovered this hidden valley, Staten Island's South Shore was itself something of a Shangri-La, a world away from the rest of New York City. The Colorado River took it beyond that, an escape from the paradise in which we already lived, a retreat into a lost world like something out of Arthur Conan Doyle. The only thing missing was dinosaurs. So that's the Colorado River. It's a relatively short piece. And again, one of these things, I really didn't know where it was going to go, but I knew that it was too important not to revisit. And during my sabbatical, I went back there. I went back to the Colorado River with a friend of mine and looked at it again and was reminded a lot of things about it. My essay also talks about the geology of the Colorado River, how it was formed and so on during the time of the glaciers.
Could I
yeah.
ask a question about the previous comment you made on memoir writing?
Yes.
If you're Harry Truman,
Uh,
and you're going to write a memoir of his political experience,
yes.
what you postulate is a kind of a postmodern, and I understand, postmodern understanding of
Yes.
reality that is interpreted by your own experiences.
Right.
If you're Harry Truman,
Yes.
don't you have to have a little bit more sensitivity toward the actual factual world? Now, I know the factual, Nietzsche says all facts can be interpreted, but there's an actual factual world in history
Yes.
and politics
Yes.
that you have to pay attention to.
Yes.
So the memoir has to be written in a different kind of a way.
What you're talking about is a question of rhetoric. Okay? What's my purpose for writing this memoir? Who are my audience? What am I trying to accomplish? So if you're Harry Truman and you're trying to give what you feel is an accurate account of the Yalta Conference or whatever it is, then that's your rhetorical purpose, and you have to sort of meet that rhetorical purpose. If you're a nobody like me, and you're just sort of taking a stroll sort of down memory lane, and trying to have other sort of ordinary folks identify with your experience, that's a different rhetorical situation. So I think we can't put all memoirs under the same umbrella. I think they have different purposes. So what I'm trying to do, and I think what anybody who's interested in creative nonfiction does, is not only to sort of give their version, but also to celebrate the language, to do interesting things with sentences and metaphors and imagery, which Harry Truman probably is not interested in. You know, people who write creative nonfiction try to do it in a way that sort of impinges onto the realm of poetry, if they're good enough. All right? Which Harry Truman, I don't think, could care about. So that's my answer. It really depends on your purpose for writing. Okay, next slide. This essay called "You Can Have Manhattan." This is a train ticket that when you rode the old Staten Island Rapid Transit when I was a kid, there was an actual conductor who rode the train and who walked along with you on the train, and he had his little change maker, and he had his little ticket book, and wherever you got on, he would punch the ticket, and where you got off, he would punch the ticket. And so if you went only from Annandale to Great Kills, it cost you 10 cents. If you went from Annandale to St. George, it cost you 35 cents. And so every time you got on the train, you got one of these tickets. And this is the train station, okay? And again, my town of Annandale. It still looks that way today. So here's a brief excerpt from my piece, You Can Have Manhattan. And again, what I try to do in this piece is describe the incredible hassle it is to get from the South Shore of Staten Island to Midtown Manhattan. So we start out, the scene here is my mother is taking my brother and me to a movie at a big theater in Midtown Manhattan. And my brother and I are just dying to see this movie. And so my mother is taking us to the city, which we hardly ever did. If once a year, we were lucky. Not even that. We never, ever traveled into the city. The only time I went to the city was on a bus on a school trip. But to have my mother take us, unheard of. That's why this scene is why it's so vivid in my mind, because it was so rare that I traveled to Manhattan with my mother. So we drive from our house, and our street, as you saw from the picture, is just lined with trees. There are a few houses, but it's mostly just trees the whole way. And then we arrive in Annandale's downtown district, less than a block long, home of Ambler's Delicatessen, Tubbs Drugstore, Nealon's Hardware, Tornquist Plumbing, and a couple other establishments. Mom leaves the car parked by the train station. We walk to the northbound tracks and wait, pacing the platform for an endless 15 minutes. We finally see the train approaching from the south. Once we board, the conductor punches our tickets and collects the fare. As the train rattles along the tracks, he calls out the name of every station, emphasizing the first syllable of each town. Great Kills next, Great Kills, Newdorp, Dungan Hills, Grant City, Stapleton, Tompkinsville, St. George. The SIRT has taken half an hour to reach the ferry. Then we wait. 15 minutes, 20, 25. The big boat finally rumbles into the slip and we hustle on board. Blasting its horn, the ferry chugs toward Battery Park in Lower Manhattan, eating up yet another half hour. Walking past the food concession stand, we give the Statue of Liberty a cursory glance. Oh yeah, there it is. Can I have a hot dog now? At long last, the boat slides into the docking area, and we're swept along the gangway with the throngs of other passengers. Once in the city, the next task is finding the right subway line. The IRT, the BMT, the IND. How can you keep them all straight? We stand on the dark, dingy platform, waiting for the #1 IRT train to Times Square. It finally roars into the station and we scramble to find a seat. The succession of stops is endless. Wall Street, Fulton Street, Rector Street, Cortlandt Street, Chambers Street, Canal Street, Houston Street, 14th Street, and on and on and on. We've got to go all the way to 42nd Street. By the time we reach our destination, more than 2 hours have elapsed since we left Annandale, even though we've traveled less than 20 miles. Emerging from the loud and cramped subway, we're greeted by crowds and pigeons and noise and trash and more pigeons and cars everywhere, and concrete and asphalt and exhaust fumes and jackhammers and blaring horns and sirens and still more pigeons. Okay, so that's what it's like.
What movie did you see?
That's what it's, what's that?
Do you remember what movie it was?
Yes, it was Jack the Giant Killer.
Okay.
It's called Jack the Giant. It's a fantasy film called Jack the Giant Killer. Absolutely wonderful. Wonderful. But, you know, and so, you know, we paid a heavy price to see Jack the Giant Killer. And then, of course, you got to do the whole thing over again when you go home. So you got at least 4 hours of travel time to see a movie that lasts for an hour and a half. Anyway, you know, for people who live on Staten Island, and I hate to say this, but people spend their whole careers doing this. Every day they make this commute. For 20, 30 years, they make this commute from South Shore of Staten Island to Manhattan. My father, when I was very little, he worked for many years, 30-something years, at a shipyard in Hoboken, New Jersey. He would get up about 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would have to walk at least a mile to the train station to get on the train, to get to the ferry, to get to Manhattan, to get to the trains under the Hudson River, to get to Hoboken. It took him at least 2 hours to get to work and at least 2 hours to get home, and he did that for something like 25 years. So, you know, the price you pay, at least in those days, for living in the paradise that was Staten Island, is that many people, in order to pay their mortgage and buy their groceries, had a very, very long commute. Next slide. Okay. This essay is called The Black Hawk Patrol, and it's about my experiences in the Boy Scouts. And there I am in my Boy Scout uniform at the age of 12. This is a piece that I'm not even finished with. I'm just reading you, this is an example of when you don't know where to start anywhere. So this one starts in the middle. This is just a scene that I wanted to write about. It's not the beginning of the piece, but you got to start somewhere. So whatever you have at your disposal, that's where you begin. Another thing I always tell my students, do the easy parts first. The stuff that comes to you, okay, great. Get that down on paper, and then you build on that. So this is what I have from the Black Hawk Patrol. I have a little more that I've since written, but this was the first little bit of this that I wrote back in like March or April. And the scene takes place at William H. Pouch Scout Camp, which is located on Staten Island, in one of the very heavily wooded areas. And Pouch Camp is very much still there. That whole area. This is an interesting story. Pouch Camp is situated in a part of Staten Island called the Green Belt, which is right smack in the middle of Staten Island. It's not where I lived. Right smack in the middle. And after the Verrazano Bridge to Brooklyn was built, the plan was to build a highway connecting the furthermost bridge in Staten Island, the Outer Bridge Crossing, to New Jersey, right directly to the Verrazano Bridge. And to do that, they would have had to go right through the Greenbelt. And there was such an uproar, there was such a furor, that they didn't do it. They went around it instead. So I'm so happy that some people sort of took a stand and made sure that some of the wild areas of the island were preserved. So Pouch Camp is still there today, which I'm very happy about. But anyway, this takes place in April of 1965 when I was in the 6th grade, and I was 11, almost 12. The 1965 Boy Scout Camporee was a week-long event at Pouch Camp, located in Staten Island's Greenbelt, a dense forest that stretched across several square miles in the heart of the borough. All the scout troops from the island were there. Each was assigned an area to set up their tents. I was expecting to pitch mine among the trees and the moss, but then I discovered that the designated camping ground was an expanse of bare, dusty, red clay, like the field near my house where we played baseball. I picked a spot, erected my canvas pup tent, and threw my sleeping bag and my knapsack in it. I felt a headache coming on. I wanted to lie down for a few minutes. The weather was warmer than normal for April, making the interior of the tent uncomfortably stuffy. I rubbed my eyes and temples. On top of everything else, my bladder was about to explode. I emerged from the tent into the bright sunshine and spotted Mr. Carby. He often helped out with Troop 5. His son Kenny, a year my senior, was one of my fellow scouts. I said, "Mr. Carby, where's the bathroom?" He answered, "You see that big building over there? Just go in that building and use the trough." The trough? What's this about a trough? Didn't they have a regular bathroom? I already avoided the ones at school. In fact, I had never used them. I always waited until I got home. And now I'm supposed to seek this cavernous structure with a giant communal urinal. When I walked through the door, the scene was worse than I'd feared. Before me was a vast stainless steel basin with angular edges and a bottom that tilted down toward a series of central drains. The thing must have been 20 feet long and 8 feet wide. Around its perimeter were young scouts and withered old men, some probably as ancient as 40, all partaking in this unique bonding experience. 24 streams or more, simultaneously hitting that grayish expanse of galvanized sheet metal. It sounded like a downpour on the roof of a bus shelter. That was my experience with the Boy Scouts. The sort of persona of this piece is a kid who has this gigantic world inside his head, but who isn't quite as comfortable in the workings of daily life. That's the sort of persona here. And I guess I'm kind of still that way.
There's the bathroom.
No, now I only use the trough now. Next slide, please. This is an essay called Friday Night Light. Now, this is a rather mediocre painting that I did when I was 15 years old. And it's a painting of me and my brother and one of our friends during a sleepover when we saw an honest-to-goodness UFO. And we did not know what it was. And we were terrified. And so this is about a year after it happened, I did this painting, when it was still relatively fresh in my mind. So this piece is about the night that we saw the UFO. It was Friday, March the 4th, 1967. I remember the date. Now what's interesting about this piece is that, again, I knew I wanted to write about the UFO. But again, I had no idea where it was going to go. What it turned into, which I could not have predicted, was a rumination on the idea of memory and what creates memory. And I had no inkling when I started writing about that theme was going to emerge. It just did. You know, one of the things Joan Didion tells writers when she's talking about the material that you're working with, she tells them, you don't tell it, it tells you. If you work enough with your material, it will take you places that you did not expect to go. This is something I've seen over and over and over again. So this is a fairly long piece. I'm just going to read a little bit of it here. So this takes place after, the narrative picks up just after we had seen the UFO. It was only above the tree line for maybe 3 minutes, and it sort of went again horizontally, very, very slowly. It was no way it was an airplane. And then it like stopped, and then it went down below the trees, and we could no longer see it. It was very strange. So we were creeped out, and yet at the same time, we felt exhilarated. Did you see that? What was that thing? It's like we were members of an exclusive club. Best of all, now we had a story to tell. And there was this weird ball of light, and it was glowing red, and it was moving real slow, and then it looked like it stopped, and there was no sound, and there was no way it was an airplane, and we watched it for like 5 minutes, and man, were we scared! Telling the tale would be different today. Picture a 21st century sleepover visited by a UFO. Somebody grabs their cell phone, records the whole thing, and then uploads the video to YouTube. Cameras might capture the light that hits their lenses, but memories are also about emotion and interpretation. That glowing ball looked big to us because we saw it as big. It was scary because we felt it was scary. But if I had hurriedly snapped a photo with my little Kodak Instamatic camera, our unidentified flying object would have been a crimson speck, barely visible against the silhouettes of the leafless trees. It'd be the same with a YouTube post. Jaded viewers would say how phony or small the UFO looked, and then they would trade insults with the writers of other comments. Everything preserved, so much lost. Sure, it's good to take pictures. It's good to know some things with a fair amount of certainty. But when pictures and documents become our only sources as we write our lives, we are no longer authors. only transcribers. There must be blank spaces for us to fill, not with deliberate fabrications, but with imperfect, incomplete, or enhanced memories. Imperfect cultural memories created King Arthur, Guinevere, Achilles, Gilgamesh, Johnny Appleseed, and the rest. Even Betty and Barney Hill, the most famous UFO abductees of all time, and the supposed flying saucer crash at Roswell, New Mexico, have become part of the American mythos. I don't want to know whether those spacecraft fragments in Roswell were really a weather balloon. In this case, I want the myth. So that's what that piece ended up being about. It's funny, again, how those things emerge. But the more I'm thinking about it, so I don't have very many records. I have this painting, which of course is an interpretation of the event. I also, and I write about this extensively in this essay, we had a magazine that we'd only gotten a few weeks earlier. Remember Look magazine? It used to be Look magazine. They published a special issue all about flying saucers. And in that issue was an official Air Force UFO report form. And my brother filled it out. Only a month after we saw the UFO. Only a month. And thank goodness he did not mail it to the Air Force. Because I still have it. And that proved, so that's an incident where a document did come in handy. But again, even the document is an interpretation of the experience. So I do have that artifact, which I treasure. Here. Okay, next slide, please. This is an essay called Better Living Through Chemistry. That's me with my chemistry set. Boy, did I love my chemistry set. And for a number of years, chemistry was my thing. I love science. To this day, I love science. I love chemistry. I love geology. And so there was a time period from about 1965 to about 1970 where I was very much into chemistry sets and experiments and all these sorts of things. And the chemistry always came with this sort of booklet, with these sort of well-scrubbed, earnest-looking young men, planning America's future with their chemistry sets. And of course, that's the same bottle of copper sulfate that I have here, which I've had for, more than 50 years. And so this is about chemistry. This is a very, very long piece. This piece is over 20 pages long. Because I had so much to say about chemistry and certain things that we did with chemicals, some of which got us into a great deal of trouble. Got my brother's hand burned one time. He was mixing up one of our many gunpowder formulas. But the trouble was he was mixing all the chemicals at once with a mortar and pestle, and the friction set off the gunpowder. And the flames went right up his arm. We had to take him to the emergency room. My father said, "Just tell him you burned it on a gas stove." But anyway, this is Better Living Through Chemistry. Now, the first part of this takes place in 1965. Then the later part I'm going to read takes place 5 years later in 1970, just before I start my senior year of high school. So this begins with the beginning of the 7th grade. I fell in love with chemistry in the 7th grade. When I walked into Mr. Jerome Jackalow's science class in September 1965, I saw a tall jar of crystals on his desk. They were blue, jagged, and rock-like, not angular like quartz, and as long as my thumb. I had never seen anything so vividly, deeply blue in all my life. I was transfixed. Copper sulfate, the teacher said. I thought those crystals were a marvel, the product of real-life alchemy. Copper was copper. The reddish metal, a stretched-out penny on the railroad track. Sulfur came in crumbly yellow chunks. Yet when you put them together,
you got these beautiful, blue, glassy stones, like shards of sky that had fallen from the earth. So that's what got me on my chemistry kick, was that science class. Now we jump ahead to July of 1970. July 5th, 1970 to be precise, the day after the 4th of July. And every morning of July 5th, my brother and one of my friends, a kid named Paul, would go down to the beach and collect all the unexploded fireworks, all the duds that didn't go off, that had a tiny bit of fuse left on them, and they didn't explode. The ones with enough fuse on them, we would light them and blow them up. The ones with the fuse was like inaccessible, we just broke them open and dumped all the gunpowder into one big container. Add that to the fact that in our basement we were concocting all sorts of other formulas that would go bang just as much as this stuff does. So now this is New York City. You're not supposed to blow off fireworks within the New York City limits. Now everybody did anyway. And like all the grown-ups could blow these things off on the 4th of July, and there was no cops in sight, okay? But for kids, that's a different story. So anyway, here it is, the morning of July 5th, and we've gone to the beach, we have all these duds, and we take them out into the woods. We head north into the woods to Lipset Avenue, a deserted, trash-strewn stretch of road which has never been properly paved and which boasts of no houses, either on it or near it. The next street over, Barclay Avenue, is sparsely populated and a quarter mile away. Lipset is bounded by thick woods, boggy soil, and dense undergrowth. All kinds of weeds, cattails, poison ivy, big trees, little saplings, chest-high grass, and thorny green vines. In some spots, the terrain looks more like a Louisiana bayou than a piece of land within the confines of New York City. Running the whole distance between Highland Boulevard and Amboy Road, Lipset Avenue was the middle of nowhere. A place where stolen cars were abandoned and set on fire. I would go there and pry the chrome insignias from the rusted hulks. Chevy Impala, Ford Falcon, Oldsmobile 88, I had a whole collection. This is the perfect place to set off all of our duds and detonate the bomb we can make from the salvaged gunpowder and other chemicals. It's a hot day and about to get hotter. The duds go first, mostly firecrackers. Bam, bam, bam! Then a cherry bomb. Boom! And then we look up, and there's a cop car. It's about 200 yards away, coming from the direction of Highland Boulevard, moving slowly. We bolt. Ralph and Paul flee together, southward through the tall, dry grass. It's so high they can barely be seen. In an instant, they're gone. Stupidly, I keep running on Lipset Avenue, west toward Amboy Road, until I decide to take cover in the woods. I make a quick left turn, putting myself on a trajectory back toward my house. I'm in a swampy area, full of fallen leaves and trees and last autumn's leaves now wet and slimy on the ground. There's a lot of underbrush, and this summer's leaves are big and green and everywhere. Even though I'm no more than 20 feet from the road, I can barely see Lipset Avenue as I glance over my shoulder, still running full tilt. And then, like a character in a movie, I trip on a log and fall headlong into a patch of thorns. I quickly adjust my position so I'm on my back and can look in the direction of Lipset Avenue. But after that, I don't dare move. I'm still tangled up in the vines and branches and sticker bushes, and if I start to struggle, I'll make all kinds of noise. They've stopped where I took off into the trees. Through the tiny gaps in the dense foliage, I see the officers walking around. I lie there completely immobile. Thorns are digging into my flesh. I can hear the crackle of the police radio. Mosquitoes start to swarm onto my arms, and I don't dare swat them away. All I can do is remain a statue. What happens next?
What happens?
don't have to wait till the book comes out. I'll tell you what
I'd
happened.
like to tell the tale.
I lied there. I lay there for at least an hour.
Oh, dear.
At least an hour, and did not move a muscle. You couldn't even see my arms. There were so many mosquitoes on them. And you want to scratch your nose. You want to do all sorts of things. I did not dare move until I was sure the police were gone. So I finally get up and I run back home, which is only like half a mile away. And I get to my house, and my brother Ralph and my friend Paul are there. And I said, "What happened to you guys?" And he said, "We ran home, ran down the basement, and hid under the pool table." And I said, "Why would you hide under the pool table? Do you think the cops are going to follow you?" You know, it's just one of these strange things. Anyway, I did get away. So my permanent record was intact. I didn't have any police record. So anyway, that was part of my love of chemistry. Okay, was occasionally doing some dangerous things. So anyway, I have a lot to say about chemistry, and I have a lot to say about geology in another one of my essays. Next slide, please. This is an essay called Neat's Foot Oil. Neat's Foot Oil is the oil you put on your baseball glove to make the leather nice and soft. This is the first baseball glove I ever owned, by the way. I got it in the third grade. My mother bought it at Sears. Not the greatest purveyor of sports equipment. I didn't even realize it was a first baseman's glove until a couple of years later. I just knew it was a baseball glove.
What position did you play?
And you can say I haven't been oiling it lately.
What position did you play?
Oh, they stuck me out in the outfield. I wasn't a very good player, but I loved to play. Anyway, this is a piece called Neat's Foot Oil, and this is the field that I played on. Now, this was in high school when I was playing with my buddies. We would play at this particular field often, and so every year we would take a photo of some of the guys on the field. And this particular year it was my turn to take the picture, so I'm not in it. I do have a few where I'm in the picture, but we loved getting together and playing ball on this field. This field is legendary. The great thing about this field is that it's never been built on to this day. However, what's interesting is that the forest has reclaimed it. It's not even a field anymore. It's woods, which to me is wonderful because it has not been ravaged by quote-unquote progress. And that way nobody else can ever play on it. And we sort of have that as our field. And that certainly was our field. But anyway, this is just a brief excerpt from the essay called Neat's Foot Oil. I wrote the first version of this essay back in 1983 in one of my graduate school courses at the University of Iowa, a course on essay writing. And I've been revising it on and off ever since. So this is just the latest version. It's gone through probably more than a dozen rewrites over the years, because baseball to me is a very, very important topic. Anyway, this is the very beginning of the piece, and then I'll skip ahead a little bit. You should get some Neat's Foot oil for your glove, one of my friends said when I was 11 or 12. This was around 1965. I bought the oil at Nealon's hardware store down by the Annandale train station. And so began a rite of springtime. The first few blobs of the stuff always looked disgusting, dark and slimy against the tawny cowhide. But after the anointment had been completed, and the entire glove became a uniform dark brown, it didn't look so bad. All that remained was to find a ball, wrap the fingers around it, and then tie the whole business together with an old shoelace. When I used it, the mitt seemed new again. I never gave much thought to the whole process, but now I think I understand. Ball players make a bargain with the summer game. I will keep your rituals if you will keep me young. Then I'm skipping ahead a little bit to a description of the field. Our field was located on the corner of Page Avenue and Amboy Road in Tottenville. The playing surface was a ragged patch of sand and clay, surrounded by towering trees, scraggly bushes, and a dense, twisting expanse of green, thorny vines, the stickers, as we called them, which could swallow a ball and delay the game for 15 minutes. The bases were old car tires that some unknown kids years earlier had buried so that the rubber was almost level with the dirt. You can see this is second base right here. Home plate, anything we could find. A hubcap, a piece of cardboard, a flat rock, somebody's jacket. Such grounds require unique ground rules, like this one. A fair ball in the stickers is good for only one extra base. Or a ball that hits above the second big branch of the tree behind center field and bounces back into fair territory is still a home run. There's the tree right there. For us, a well-hit home run ball might travel about 250 feet, but extreme right field was only 171. For us, the home run was the supreme affirmation of individual achievement. It was our mid-court buzzer beater, our 50-yard field goal, our laurel garland. So that's the baseball one. There's a lot more in the baseball one. And that was one of the pieces I got published in the Staten Island paper a number of years ago.
Did you ever get home
Kind of a sad side note. One of the guys who we played with a lot, a guy named Jonathan Holman, a very good hitter. Years later, he became a New York City firefighter, and he died on September 11th.
Did you ever hit a home run?
He hit a lot of home runs, and so when I published this piece in the Staten Island paper, I devoted the piece to Jonathan and to my other friend Bill Cummings here, who also passed away. So it kind of puts things in perspective. But this is my way of remembering these guys. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is a essay called The Brainyards. And those of you who are wondering what the heck this is, this explains it. Now, I must say, this object is actually basically defines my entire book. As you'll discover in a minute. This is a very important thing to me.
Very important.
It looks kind of disgusting, but it really is, in a way, the heart and soul of the book. So there was a factory here, SS White Dental Manufacturing Plant in a town called Princess Bay. It was there for 60, 70 years. And it was a huge employer on Staten Island. Everybody knew somebody who worked at SS White. They manufactured dental equipment. You know, drills and mirrors, whatever dentists use. And they also made the amalgam for fillings. And in those days, God help us, the amalgam was made with mercury. And right here was a dump, just right out in the open, where they would dump all their chemicals, right there. Just take them out in a wheelbarrow or something. And there was, including vials of mercury. And so, what did we do? We collected it all. I still have a vial almost this big, full of mercury, that we found at SS White. And this was one of our favorite places to play, in the toxic waste dump. And so, for my book, I was doing a lot of research on this, and I found the transcript of a court case from the 1980s about the former owner of this land and the people who bought it. And the court case was who's responsible for cleaning up the mess, because they discovered some seriously dangerous chemicals there, including PCBs, mercury, all these sorts of things. And it was just sat there, you know, and we loved it. When I was a kid, we loved it, and we called it the Brainyards, because we thought these things looked like brains. So anyway, here's my Here's an excerpt from my piece called The Brainyards. There was a stretch of land between the factory and Lemon Creek, which served as a dumping ground for SS White. The dump was wide open, not fenced in, and it was big, at least 50 feet by 100. We could stroll right in. As I surveyed the expanse, I saw metal curlicues and shavings from drill presses and lathes. The ground was littered with small bottles and vials, some of which contained a few drops of mercury. Everything was covered by a fine white powder. But best of all were the brains. They were everywhere. They weren't real brains, of course, but hardened, quasi-spherical lumps of extruded plastic that must have been forced out like toothpaste from some amazing machine deep inside the plant. They looked like little brains with fissures and convolutions. Most of them were about the size of a grapefruit. The majority felt sort of rubbery, while others were hard and would crack if you dropped them on the pavement, like this one. Once the secret of the Brainyards was out, a whole bunch of us took many bike trips from Annandale and Huguenot to Princess Bay with treasure hunting on our minds. I always brought my heavy-duty canvas Boy Scout knapsack. Every time we left SS White, it was stuffed. It's weird, really. Here's a bunch of 11 or 12-year-olds so excited that they catapult themselves off their bicycles, letting them crash in the sand. Then these boys swarm all over an industrial scrap heap, scooping up blobs of plastic smeared with who knows what kinds of chemicals. And no one ever said anything. There was no ornery guy yelling, "Hey, you kids, get out of there!" like you'd seen an old Little Rascals short. Open dumps like that weren't unusual back then. We didn't give it a second thought. The same thing was true when the big mosquito spraying trucks would trundle down the street, spewing thick clouds of DDT. Kids ran, shrieking with delight, through the impenetrable fog of pesticide. We were, after all, immortal and indestructible, and there was wonder in everything. Anyway, that's the Brainyards. Very, very important part of my childhood, and that's another piece that I had published in the Staten Island paper, and it got a big response from people. You know, so, oh yeah, SS White, of course. Oh, my aunt worked at SS White. You know, oh yeah, I remember those things. You know, it was really incredible. The next, before you show the next slide, let me have a little disclaimer here. The next slide is sort of the height of presumptuousness. So please forgive me. But I made this next picture up as a way of helping me stay focused on the sort of tone and content of the book. So what the next slide is a mock-up of a hypothetical cover page, just so I have in my mind what the book is about. Okay, so next slide. And so I titled the book The Brainyards, because I think it epitomizes everything that I'm talking about. If you can't read it, it says subtitle, Excavating the Artifacts of a Treasured Island. And that's me in our underground fort that my friend, his name is Torolf Tollefson, great Norwegian name, and my brother Ralph and I dug in the dirt during the 1968 New York City public school teacher strike that lasted for 2 months. 2 months. What did we do? We dug a big hole in the ground and made an underground fort. And that's how we spent the New York City teacher strike. So I have an essay about that, which I haven't even started yet. But that's what I'm going for here. That sense of, again, adventure and imagination. That you can take something like a piece of plastic and say, oh, it looks like a brain. And then, of course, we did a lot of other things with these brains. When my brother and I later went on to make home movies, Super 8 movies, we used these in some of our movies, like somebody like getting a brain transplant, that sort of thing. Let me tell you the story about this one. What's interesting is that I thought all the brains were gone. I thought that after we left home, whatever, that my mother just threw them all away. So after my mother passed away in 1999, my father had died in 1996. They were both, my father lived to be in his 90s. My mother lived to be 85. We had to go back to my old house, the one you saw from across the lake there, and clean it out because our property had been sold and the house was going to be demolished. And so that was the last time I was ever at that house. This was in May of 2000. And so we were, throwing stuff in a dumpster and saving what we wanted to save. And I decided to take a walk through the woods. And just as you get into the woods, I saw something sticking out of the dirt. I thought, well, what the heck is that? And I dug it up and I found this. It was like some sort of gift. This is the last thing here. I actually found one of the brains that I thought was lost forever. So that's why I cherish this disgusting piece of plastic. And that's why it is so essential to what this book is about. Do we have time for one more?
Sure. I think so.
We have time for one more?
Yes.
Now I don't have a slide for this one. This is fairly short. But I thought this is about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And about, remember the old duck and cover drills where you had to hide under your desk? Did anybody do those?
Yes.
You hide under your desk, they're going to drop the A-bomb on your school, and if you're under your desk, you'll be okay. So the title of this is Khrushchev at the OK Corral. In Russia, our fourth grade teacher said gravely, if your father should say anything bad about the government, they'll come and take him away, and you will never see your father again. End quote. Mrs. Hardy's lecture came during the Cuban Missile Crisis. She presented a stark picture of life under communism. A scene took root in my brain. There's a knock on our door. Men in trench coats force their way into our house, put my father in handcuffs, throw him in the backseat of a car, and drive away. Tales like Mrs. Hardy's were told in classrooms all across the country. The Russians were universally, implacably evil. Case closed. I had seen an ominous ad on TV about a Soviet maniac named Nikita Khrushchev. He was a huge bald guy who resembled two pop culture superstars, horror movie actor Tor Johnson and Superman's arch-enemy Lex Luthor. In the commercial, a furious Khrushchev yelled in a strange language and pounded his shoe on a table. Then a different voice, louder and doom-laden, boomed from the television. Khrushchev says, "We will bury you." I wondered quite seriously, if somebody saw Khrushchev just walking la-di-da down the street, why don't they just challenge him to a gun duel? I was thinking about TV westerns like Bat Masterson, Have Gun Will Travel, The Rifleman, Maverick, and the rest. Khrushchev was causing all the trouble. Khrushchev himself imprisoned kids' fathers at the drop of a hat. Get rid of him and everything would be okay. On Gunsmoke, if the desperado showed his ugly mug in Dodge City, he was taking his chances. Khrushchev visited the United States from time to time. All you had to do was wait for him to poke his nose through the batwing doors of Miss Kitty's saloon and then yell draw. What could be more obvious? It didn't take me long to realize the folly of my solution to the Cold War. Surely there was more going on than just good guy, bad guy posturing. I asked myself, were all Russians beyond redemption? Nobody talked about that. We were bombarded with pronouncements like, in the Soviet Union, you can't go to church. And that was as far as it got. My parents kept me in the dark from all those Russian missiles in Cuba. I had only the vaguest notion that something was wrong. Then, on October 18th, 1962, we heard a knock on our classroom door. A lady from the principal's office whispered to Mrs. Hardy. After a minute, the teacher passed along the information, and a great sense of relief swept through the classroom. After the crisis had ended, we continued to conduct our air raid drills, diving under our desks and curling up in a ball until the all clear was signaled. That folderol didn't scare me. It was no different from a fire drill. We tolerated those, never believing for an instant that the school would or could burn down. Duck and cover was just another ridiculous thing that grown-ups made us do. 2 years later, in the 6th grade, I made a big deal out of reading Eugene Burdick and Harvey Wheeler's Failsafe, the bestseller about an American B-52 loaded with nuclear warheads accidentally sent to bomb Moscow. It was the first written-for-adults novel I'd ever purchased. I placed the paperback with its bright red cover conspicuously on the top of my book pile as I left our classroom and sat on the school bus, making sure everybody could see the mature and timely piece of literature I was reading. I didn't understand most of it. One of the Air Force generals had nightmares about a bullfight. What was that about? There was a strange seduction scene involving some Pentagon egghead. As a 12-year-old, I found the scene both confusing and riveting. But the book made me ponder the Cold War as a real-life problem. The air raid drills became a little scary. The only good thing nuclear weapons ever did, I decided, was create mutants. People, bugs, blobs, whatever. And awaken ancient creatures from their slumber. Could I imagine life without atomic monster movies? A life where there's no amazing colossal man? Inconceivable. No them and its giant ants? Impossible. No Beast from 20,000 Fathoms? No H-Man? No The Day the World Ended? No Attack of the Crab Monsters? No War of the Colossal Beast? No Beast of Yucca Flats? The complete destruction of civilization as we know it is one thing. But a world without Godzilla? Unthinkable. Anyway, I guess we ran a little long here. I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything. Any questions or comments?
Did you and your twin brother ever talk about these memories together?
Oh yeah, sure. And when writing the book, he lives in Bethlehem, PA, the other side of the state. And so I would email him and get some, and he remembered certain things that I didn't, and he gave me a lot of this stuff. You know, he had the copper sulfate crystals at his house. So you know, some of the things I got from him. So yeah, he's very helpful in remembering. You know, he remembers things that I don't remember. He remembered at the time about a kid in the 6th grade brought a praying mantis cocoon egg case into school and left it there over the weekend. And we came in on Monday and there's 1,000 praying mantises.
Oh my God.
And I totally forgot about that. And he reminded me. So yeah, he remembers a lot. Yeah.
What I find amazing is I think many of us have the same symbols mean something to us. You mentioned mercury, you mentioned the copper sulfate.
Yes.
Those are in our lives too,
Oh yeah.
and those dumps and things like that.
Oh absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure.
We lived in that era.
And it's worth preserving. And even for people who have not lived in that era, I hope that these stories have something that transcend those times and speaks to something universal about what it means to be a kid and what it means to find something, to find wonder in the most ordinary object. And so one of the reasons I call the piece Excavating Artifacts is because all of these things, like this little button, Cafeteria Service Squad, you know, this means something to me and it evokes memories that then trigger a flood of ideas and recollections that will take you on a ride that you can't even anticipate. So almost every piece in my book is connected to some sort of artifact in some way. Here's the original of the UFO painting. Okay, There's the actual painting. So anyway,
The diving tournament, you were a winner in the diving tournament?
well, that's a whole, I can't even get into that now. I could be here for another hour. I have a
That's the
plaque
sequel.
here. I have a plaque here. It says Acapulco Invitation, 1971. Cliff diving competition, first place, Tottenville High School, and my name.
Oh,
Okay,
that's nice.
okay. There was never a cliff diving team.
Was there a cliff?
We made it up. A bunch of friends and I made it up when we were seniors in high school. It was just, again, it takes an hour to explain this. But we came up with this idea. It was we got a form about, you got to write down your activities for the yearbook. And so I said to a buddy of mine, let's make up a team and put it on the yearbook thing. And what do you want to do? Well, I love watching the cliff diving on Wide World of Sports, I love watching that. So let's make up the cliff diving team. So like 15 of us put it on our thing for the yearbook. And then it just got a life of its own.
Everyone was first place.
That's right. Everybody got first. One of the guy's fathers made these plaques for us. We got our picture in the yearbook.
Any tickets to Acapulco?
We marched in parades. We marched in the Staten Island Flag Day parade. We marched in some parade over in Brooklyn. And it was all made up. We had a banquet. We had an awards banquet in the summertime. We gave out awards, trophies, and we sent an invitation to President Nixon. He did not show up. So anyway, that's a whole other story, and I haven't even written that piece. There's so much about that. But again, it's all about the power of imagination and how you can make things happen. And just started out as just a joke, turned into this enormous thing that people talk about to this day, that people in my high school class talk about to this day.
It's a children's world.
It was a phenomenon. So